Hello, everyone. It is time for the latest recording, which is the American Revolution. Again, this one will be in two or more parts. Again, I sound like a broken record to use that kind of obsolete expression, but again, you can always pause whenever you want. You're completely in control, but I think it still is less intimidating to break it up into chunks. So this will probably last somewhere between half an hour and 45 minutes. Then there will be a part two, maybe a part three, depending on where I feel like making a break. But again, you're always free to pause, replay anything you want as well. So without further ado, I will switch to the share screen. Okay, so again, as with the colonial unit, I am not trying to cover everything here. I am not trying to cover every nuance of every law, every battle. That is what the textbook is for, but I'm trying to highlight some of the more important things. And again, you can go to the textbook to be filled in on all the details. One thing we will particularly focus on is the Declaration of Independence. And our opening image here shows the Declaration in its modern home in the National Archives in Washington. So about the middle part of this unit, we will go over the Declaration in depth because it is such an important document in U.S. history. To understand the grievances of the Americans at the start of the Revolution, we should look at the English system of government because the colonists did at first ground their argument in the traditional rights of Englishmen. As the build up to the Revolution continued, increasingly they talk about the rights of mankind. In the Declaration itself, as you will see, we talk about all men are created equal, etc. There's not really much talk about the rights of Englishmen. But the original arguments from the 1760s say Americans have the rights that the English people in England have. So it is good to know how the English system of government works. There is a hereditary monarch. The king if male, the queen if female. At the time of the Revolution, as you may know, the ruler is King George III. Today, for almost the last 70 years, the monarch has been Queen Elizabeth II. These days, the king has very little power. Again, we will see how the power of the king decreased. By the early 18th century, the king is not really the true source of power. And today, Queen Elizabeth is more or less a pure figurehead. The prime minister is the person who really is in control of the country on a day-to-day basis. Again, we're not going into enormous detail about English history here, but that is the pattern of the medieval and early modern period, that the power of parliament grows and the power of the king decreases. And parliament consists of two houses, the House of Lords and the House of Commons. The House of Lords mainly consists of the hereditary nobles or the aristocracy, dukes, earls, barons. If you are the duke of such and such and you die, then your oldest son becomes the next duke after you. And someday his oldest son will be the next duke after him. It is a hereditary position from oldest son to oldest son. Also, the bishops of the Church of England also are members of Parliament. That is an appointed position. Again, since the Reformation, it is the king who has control here, not the Pope off in Rome. But the bishops of the church also have a place in the House of Lords. The House of Commons is the elected representatives of the English counties and major towns known as boroughs. They are considered to represent the people, although in practice, in most of these boroughs, only property owners can vote. So they do not really represent a broad-based electorate. Most adult men, let alone women or children, do not have the right to vote. But nonetheless, the House of Commons is considered to represent the people. Medieval kings, under pressure from the aristocracy, had promised, most famously in the document called Magna Carta, which was issued by King John in the year 1215, that a person could not be taxed without his consent or the consent of his representatives. Therefore, all taxes had to be approved by Parliament. The House of Lords representing the nobility, and again, the House of Commons, even though not truly democratic by our modern standards, was considered to represent the people. And so therefore, any taxation had to be approved by both houses of Parliament. Traditional English liberties also included trial by jury. If you were accused of a crime, you must be tried by a jury of 12 of your peers. The verdict of guilty or not guilty must be unanimous. And if you were found unanimously not guilty, you could not be tried again for the same crime. That would be called double jeopardy, and that was forbidden. Also, habeas corpus, that is a Latin phrase that means you may have the body, not in the sense of a corpse, but in the sense of a body of evidence. What that means in practice is a person cannot be imprisoned without formal charges. The king cannot simply throw you in prison because he doesn't like you, because you have said something critical of him. He must provide the reasons why, and then it must quickly proceed to trial by jury. If you are wondering where the name Britain or British comes from, King James I, who was already King James VI of Scotland, the country just to the north of England on the island of Great Britain, he became King of England. He inherited the throne of England in the year 1603. For the next century or so, England and Scotland had the same king, but still different parliaments, different court systems. However, in the year 1707, they were fully merged together into a single nation under the name of Great Britain, with one parliament. And so from this point onward, it is more accurate to refer to the British government rather than the English government in terms of their dealings with the colonists. Here we see a meeting of Parliament in the Middle Ages. The king is actually present. The king is supposed to address Parliament at the start of each session. That is kind of the precedent for our American State of the Union address. Although, again, in modern times, the monarch's speech is pretty much written by the prime minister and his staff, and does not express the monarch's own opinions. Again, today the monarch is, for the most part, a figurehead. And the ideal that the British believed in this era was called mixed government, or the balanced constitution. The idea was there were basically three types of government: monarchy, ruled by a king; aristocracy, ruled by hereditary nobles; and democracy, ruled by the people. And any of those three could go too far and be abused. A king could become a tyrant, an aristocracy could become a corrupt oligarchy, ruling only for their own benefit, and a democracy could become mob rule. So even though the English did treasure the right of the people to have a voice. They did not believe in pure democracy. They thought the best government was part monarchy, part aristocracy, part democracy. And so they thought with the king, the House of Lords, and the House of Commons, they had achieved this ideal. And so colonial governments tried to imitate this. There was a governor who was, except in Connecticut and Rhode Island, the governor was appointed either by the king or in Pennsylvania and Maryland by the proprietor. There was a council that in most colonies was appointed by the governor. So it was not hereditary like the House of Lords, but it did draw its power from a source other than the people and was supposed to represent the elite of the colony. And then you had the House that, depending on the colony, might be called the Assembly, the House of Representatives, in Virginia, famously called the House of Burgesses, that was elected by the people. Again, when I say the people, I mean adult white men with property. But in America, the number of people who had property was much higher than in England. So compared to the English House of Commons, these were relatively democratic bodies. So you can see some similarity with the modern idea of separation of powers, which we will talk about next week when we talk about the Constitution, the idea of executive, judicial, and legislative branches. You can see it is a three-part government, but not quite the same. The House of Lords and the House of Commons, or the Council and the House of Representatives, combine to have the legislative power. The judicial power in this system is not put on an equal level. But you can see there is some degree of similarity. In Britain, the two political parties during this time are the Tories, who favor a greater role for the king, and the Whigs, who emphasize the power of Parliament. And in the 17th century, in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, the Whigs are in power for a very long time. Again, I mentioned this briefly last time, the so-called Glorious Revolution in 1688, when King James II is overthrown in England, which leads to the overthrow of the Dominion of New England in America. That is really what gives Parliament the upper hand permanently. They bring in new monarchs, William and Mary, and they make clear Parliament is in control. And the Whigs are the driving force behind this. And so for most of the next several decades, the Whigs are in power. In fact, they are in power for so long that some people think they have lost their true principles. And so a group arises called the Real Whigs, who, as the name kind of indicates, are basically saying the Whigs in Parliament have forsaken true Whig principles, and we are here to call them back to that. The most famous Real Whigs were a pair of pamphleteers named John Trenchard and Thomas Gordon, who wrote a series of articles under the pseudonym Cato. And they put forward the idea that liberty is constantly in danger. If you let the tyrant take an inch, he will take a mile. You have to be vigilant at the very first sign that your liberties are about to be taken away from you. And again, you can see the influence here on the revolution. Even a relatively small tax is seen as the first step toward full-fledged tyranny. There is also the fear of corruption, particularly corruption of the legislature by the monarch, that the king might get his way in Parliament by promising nice jobs to the legislators who vote his way. If you vote for the bill the king favors, he will reward you by giving you some nice, good salary in a government post. And so people must always be vigilant, always be on the watch for the first sign of tyranny or corruption. Again, this is, as you can see, a very strong influence on the thinking of the American revolutionaries. Now, you probably never heard of these guys before. A guy you may have vaguely heard of at some point in your education is John Locke. John Locke is a very important figure in the history of political philosophy, who put forward the right to rebel against a tyrannical government, particularly one that failed to protect property. And again, we'll talk more about that later on, but he is a major influence on Thomas Jefferson. Next week, when we get to the Constitution, Baron de Montesquieu, who you can probably figure out is French, he was an author who advocated separation of powers. That was very much not the way things were in France. The monarch was an absolute monarch, but Montesquieu thought this was the way it should be, with a separate executive, legislative, and judicial powers. And again, that will be a major influence on the US Constitution. So again, I'm just giving you the highlights here. I definitely refer you to your textbook for the full details. Again, the textbook will talk about the French and Indian War, otherwise known as the 7 Years' War, which is a big victory for Britain. They conquer Canada from the French. The French also vacate Louisiana and sell that to Spain. And so this century of rivalry between Britain and France for control of North America has been decisively won by Britain. But Britain is deeply in debt. And so we have, again, the British government is a bit turbulent during this time. Prime ministers and cabinets come and go frequently until finally Lord North becomes prime minister in 1770, and he will be prime minister for over a decade. But all these prime ministers agree that the colonies must provide tax revenue to assist in payment of the debt and to fund the continued British military presence in America. Again, my job here is not to overwhelm you with detail. Go with the textbook for full details on the various laws on colonial resistance from the Stamp Act through the Tea Act. We see several cases where the British government backs down, but then a few years later they try again, and the colonists once again rise up in opposition. And the consistent idea is the colonists see this as violating the rights of Englishmen. The Magna Carta and all these other documents say that you cannot be taxed without the consent of your representatives. There is no representative from Massachusetts or New York or Virginia or Rhode Island or any other colony in the English Parliament. Therefore, they are taxing us without our consent. Our own assemblies that we do elect, they are the ones who have the right to tax us. The full version of the expression is sometimes taxation without representation is tyranny. Again, that real Whig idea that even if the tax is relatively small, it might be the first step toward full-fledged tyranny. So it has to be resisted from the very beginning. So how does the British government defend this? Well, their concept is what they call virtual representation. Parliament represents the entire British people, including the colonies, whether or not a particular person or place was represented directly. So they go through it one by one. Women do not have the right to vote. Again, that may be controversial to us today, but it was kind of taken for granted at the time. People under the age of 21 do not have the right to vote. You have groups of people like prisoners who do not have the right to vote. And again, those without property do not have the right to vote. And in England, that is the great majority of the population. Very few people in England actually can vote. Furthermore, I mentioned that Parliament represents the counties and the boroughs, the major towns. However, the list of boroughs has not been changed in over a century. And the Industrial Revolution has begun in England. These cities like Manchester, Birmingham, Leeds have grown up to become major industrial centers, among the most populous cities in England. And yet, they are not on the list of boroughs that elect members to Parliament. And then finally, what if you are a man, you are an adult, you own property, you live in a borough that does have representation, but you vote for the losing candidate? Maybe you are a Tory and the Whig won in your district, or vice versa. Can you claim this man does not represent me because I voted for the other guy? No. Parliament represents the entire people, whether or not you voted for them directly. And so just as they represent women, just as they represent children, just as they represent people who live in Manchester or Birmingham, they represent the people who live in the colonies. And therefore, these taxes are 100% legal, 100% consistent with Magna Carta and the rights of Englishmen. But again, the people in the colonies very much disagree. And they could sometimes protest violently. Here we see a tarring and feathering in 1774 of a customs official in Boston named John Malcolm. They seized him. Again, tarring and feathering was quite brutal. It is just what it sounds like. They would pour tar over you, then cover you with feathers. And again, removing the feathers would be in some ways even more painful than the original act. And they are humiliating this guy even further by forcibly pouring tea down his throat to represent the hated tax on tea. Again, I am not going to hit the blow-by-blow account of every single thing that happens during this time. I refer you to the textbook. But one thing I would like to stop and dwell on for a moment is the Boston Massacre. Because in Chapter 6, your many histories documents, your pair of primary sources that you should compare, you have a pair of documents about the Boston Massacre. One from the British captain, and then one from a colonial witness. So it's good to just let you go over a bit what exactly happened at this event. But again, you can make your final judgment when you read these two documents. So in 1768, there was an altercation over a ship, interestingly called the Liberty, owned by the wealthy merchant John Hancock, who will later become a major Patriot leader. The British think that smuggled goods are, probably correctly, think that smuggled goods are aboard this ship, trying to evade the tax duties. Basically, a riot breaks out in response, and from this point onward, British troops are stationed in Boston. Again, this is before modern-day police forces. An army would be the way you kept order in a troublesome city. And again, that kind of real Whig idea saw this also as a major first step toward tyranny. And the soldiers were often met with hostility. And on March 5th, 1770, a group of these British soldiers fired on a hostile crowd, killing 5 people, most famously including an African American. There's a lot of mystery about him, but we think probably part African American, part Native American, but he usually has been held up as a great patriotic hero for Black Americans, Crispus Attucks. Paul Revere, we will talk about him more in a minute, his famous Midnight Ride. He makes a very inflammatory print about this event, which the colonists dub the Boston Massacre. So the soldiers are lined up in a straight line. The captain is giving the command to fire. It all seems very orderly and disciplined. The crowd looks completely peaceful. No one is throwing snowballs. No one is throwing rocks, as was the case in reality. The customs house, in front of which the soldiers are standing, is labeled Butcher's Hall. And there's even a variant version of this that shows additional guns being fired out of the window, as if this were a completely pre-planned event. And as you will know from your two documents, even the one by the colonial witness does portray this as much more chaotic. But Revere portrays it as a completely pre-planned, premeditated, disciplined massacre. Interestingly, John Adams, who will be a major patriot leader, defends the accused soldiers. He thinks they are being, I guess you can't say railroaded since there were no railroads yet, but he thinks they are being, arrested by popular opinion, when in reality, even though he thinks they are on the wrong side, he thinks they fired in self-defense. And so he and another patriot lawyer, Josiah Quincy, jointly volunteer to defend the accused soldiers and argue successfully in court. Captain Preston and most of his men are outright acquitted. Two men who were seen clearly by witnesses as having fired are convicted. They are branded on the thumb, which certainly is a very painful few minutes, but certainly a much better punishment than to be hanged. Again, Paul Revere was a silversmith by profession. He also was a pamphleteer and printer. And again, we will encounter him and his Midnight Ride in a few minutes. Actually, even less than a few minutes, more like a few seconds. So again, the Boston Tea Party, another major event. To consult your textbook. The people of Boston destroy the taxed British tea. That leads to the so-called Intolerable Acts, in which the British government tries to punish Boston. And eventually this will lead to the outbreak of revolution. Again, I am just touching some of the most important things here. Go to your textbook for the full details. So by early 1775, there is now a military government in Massachusetts that was part of the Intolerable Acts, but it really only controls Boston. Most of the countryside is under Patriot control, and as the revolutionaries will become known. And most of the sorry, got tripped over my words there. I'm not sure quite where I was going with that. They come to think that correctly, that the colonists have a cache of weapons at Concord, Massachusetts. And so the British government plans to march to Concord and seize this cache of weapons. It is sometimes said, this is not 100% clear, but it is sometimes thought they planned to stop in the town of Lexington and arrest Samuel Adams and John Hancock. Those were two of the major Patriot leaders, and they were visiting a friend in Lexington at that time. And so it is sometimes said they planned to stop there and arrest Adams and Hancock, but that is not 100% clear. Somehow, and this is another historical mystery, it has sometimes even been said that General Gage's wife may have been the leaker. She was known to be sympathetic to the Patriots, but by some means or other, Patriot leaders in Boston, the Sons of Liberty, as they were called, find out about this. And so Paul Revere is the guy commissioned to go to the countryside and inform people this is about to happen. Paul Revere is immortalized in the famous poem by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Revere is a nice name that rhymes with a lot of different words. And so the poem starts, "Listen, my children, you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. On the 18th of April in 75, hardly a man is now alive who remembers that famous day and year." But he is actually not the only one who is sent out. There's also William Dawes. So you can see here, the blue is Revere's route. He takes a more northerly route, while Dawes in green takes the more southerly route. They meet up in Lexington. Again, they warn Hancock and Adams, get out of town, which they do. And they are joined by a third man, Samuel Prescott. On the way to Concord, they are actually stopped by a patrol of British soldiers. Revere is actually temporarily captured, although he is soon set free. Dawes escapes back to Lexington, and it is actually Samuel Prescott who escapes in the right direction and does arrive to inform the people of Concord. I should also say that none of these men said the British are coming, because the colonists still considered themselves British. What they actually said was the regulars are out. The regulars meaning the professional British Army stationed in Boston. And then eventually, a few hours later, the route in red on this map is taken by the British soldiers across the Charles River. Another line from the famous Longfellow poem, "One if by land, two if by sea." Again, sea is another word that makes some nice rhymes, but actually it was across the Charles River that they went, not by sea. That is why two lanterns were hung. Again, the militia is the term referring to the sort of citizen army. The British Army during the French and Indian War, and then later the Continental Army during the Revolution, is supposed to be supplemented by ordinary citizen soldiers. And in Massachusetts, they call themselves the Minutemen. The idea being they will be ready in a minute's notice. And they do confront the British soldiers at Lexington on the way to Concord. There is probably an exchange of gunfire. It is actually not quite clear if the colonial soldiers actually fired. We do know that 8 colonists were killed, whereas the British get out of Lexington without any casualties. Then at Concord itself, there is a second exchange of gunfire. This time, a few people are killed on both sides, and the weapons store had been removed before the British arrival. So the warning by Revere, etc., et al., was successful, and the colonists hide the weapons. As the news spreads throughout the countryside, the British retreat toward Boston, and the Minutemen harass them all the way. Basically, ambush techniques, jumping out of the bushes and firing. They are harassed pretty much all the way back to Boston. And for the next year or so, they will hole themselves up in Boston while the colonists control the countryside. The Continental Congress, which is the meeting of all the 13 colonies that has come into existence in response to the British laws, names George Washington of Virginia as commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. He was a veteran of the French and Indian War. In fact, as you will know when you read your textbook, he plays a major part in the fact that the war starts to begin with. When he was a very young man, he was sent by the government of Virginia into modern-day Western Pennsylvania, and that led to the outbreak of the French and Indian War. So he's an experienced military person, and he is appointed commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. So again, as I've said a million times already, I am not covering everything in this PowerPoint. As far as the military aspect of the war goes, I will basically cover the beginning, the middle, and the end. So this is the beginning, obviously. In part 2, I will cover the middle, the Battle of Saratoga, a very important turning point battle, and then the final major battle, the Battle of Yorktown in 1781. For all the things in between, the Battle of Princeton, crossing the Delaware, the Battle of Monmouth, and so forth, consult your textbook. But I'm sort of giving you the highlights here. Here is the map of the Lexington and Concord area. All right, so by the year 1776, increasingly, there's a movement toward independence. Thomas Paine, who is actually a native of England, he's a relatively recent settler of the colonies. He publishes a pamphlet entitled Common Sense. Just what it sounds like, he says it is only common sense that the colonies should be independent of England. And increasingly, the colonial legislatures begin setting up state governments. The royal governors have fled in most cases, and so the legislatures start writing new state constitutions. This is de facto independence, meaning in fact. So they are not yet using the word independence, but they are acting as if they are. Rhode Island, for example, this is sometimes called Rhode Island Independence Day. On May 4th, 1776, they say that their officials no longer need to take an oath of allegiance to the king. As I mentioned before, Rhode Island and Connecticut had the right to elect their own governors even during the colonial time. And so they do not write new state constitutions. They just take their charters, cross out mentions of the king, cross out mentions of England, and then continue operating as before. Connecticut will finally have a new state constitution in 1818, Rhode Island only in the 1840s. And although it is not mentioned in your textbook, in a future recording, I will talk a bit about the so-called Dorr Rebellion, which is a major event in Rhode Island history. Will be, I guess, next week, maybe the week after. I have to consult the syllabus. I think it would be next week. All right, so on June 7th, 1776, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia proposes motions in favor of independence in the Continental Congress. Several of the colonies are not yet ready to take this plunge. New England and Virginia are all for it, but the middle colonies and the deep South, many of them are not yet ready to take the plunge. So Congress puts off a vote to the first week of July, but appoints a committee to draft a Declaration of Independence. The members of the committee are John Adams, Benjamin Franklin of Massachusetts, Benjamin Franklin of Pennsylvania, Thomas Jefferson of Virginia, Robert Livingston of New York, and Roger Sherman of Connecticut. Here is Thomas Paine. As you probably know, Jefferson is the main author of the Declaration, but that is where I will end for today. So we are, or at least for this recording. So we are not quite at the halfway point, but we are kind of at the chapter break. We have covered chapter 6 and just barely started chapter 7. And I want to talk about the Declaration all at one time rather than breaking that in two. So I will pick up with the Declaration in part 2. So just to give you a bit of a preview, again, the Battle of Saratoga, the alliance with France. I will talk about certain groups such as African Americans, Native Americans, women, how they responded to the revolution. Then I will wrap up with the Battle of Yorktown and the Treaty of Paris ending the revolution. So that is on the agenda for part 2. And again, part 2 sort of corresponds to chapter 7. Part 1 sort of corresponds to chapter 6. Again, as I've said already, the chapters go into a lot more detail. And so let me just open up the right file. Hold on. So you can see I've got a study guide to help guide you through the chapters 6 and 7. You can see many of the things we have talked about are on this list, but it is quite a bit longer. And that will help you take the quizzes on each chapter. All right, so again, I will maybe later today, maybe tomorrow, I will do the second half recording, and so probably tomorrow, since I am a bit ahead of myself here. This is Wednesday's chapter. I'm recording it on Tuesday. If I go too fast, I might kind of accidentally put pressure on you to think you have to go just as fast. So I probably will record part 2 tomorrow. But I mean, it doesn't really matter. Maybe I will do it later today. I'm sure you know how to self-pace yourself. All right, so I guess I'll turn off the share screen. You can see my lovely face once again. So again, we're off to a good start, I hope. I am recording this on Tuesday morning. So again, I hope again, the first quiz was technically assigned to Monday, but I did leave it open to be taken to the end of the day Tuesday. And the second quiz also is due at the end of today. So tonight I will check to see who has completed those quizzes. And then again, there is a quiz every day. We do have of course, I have to look at them as well, but you do have a tough schedule here of a quiz every day. And again, the weekends are for relaxing from the quizzes, but instead writing your response papers and having your online discussion. So it is a very intensive 3-week schedule, but it will probably be over with before we know it. And you will feel that you have completed a good class, I hope. So no point in continuing to prattle on like that. So I will turn off my microphone, camera, and the recording. And again, part 2, maybe later today, but more likely tomorrow. Okie dokie.